Our office recently released its forecast of the state's fiscal condition. One of the main determinants of the state's fiscal condition is the amount of Proposition 98 funding that needs to be provided to school districts and community colleges. In our report, we estimate this Proposition 98 funding requirement for 2011-12 as well as each of the subsequent 5 years. So in the next few minutes, I wanted to highlight the findings of our report pertaining to Proposition 98, beginning with an update on the current year budget, turning to the coming budget cycle, and then looking out on the horizon over the next 4 years. So beginning with an update on the current year budget situation. As part of the 2011-12 budget package, the state assumed that it would receive $4 billion in additional general fund revenue. If the $4 billion ultimately didn't materialize, then the budget package contained provisions that would automate trigger cuts. As you can see from the slide, virtually all Tier 1, and most of Tier 2 Proposition 98 reductions would be triggered. The cuts, the Proposition 98 reductions, would total $1.5 billion, with preschool, school districts, and community college funding all being reduced. School districts would absorb the bulk of the reduction, with revenue limits being reduced $1.1 billion. The impact of these reductions on districts will vary depending on the decisions districts already have made in building their 11-12 budgets. Those districts that had more cautious budget assumptions, that might have thought that the $4 billion would not materialize, will not be as affected as adversely. These districts also are likely to be carrying relatively robust reserves. So in response to the trigger cuts, they'll very likely draw down their reserves, but not have to make additional programmatic reductions. By comparison, some districts probably built their budgets with much more optimistic budget assumptions, assuming that the $4 billion in revenue would materialize. So these districts also, because they haven't downsized their programs, are likely to be carrying less robust reserves. So in response to the trigger cuts, they're likely first to draw down their reserves, but if their reserves are at the minimum level required by state law, they won't be sufficient to be able to absorb the entire cut. In addition, these districts might attempt to try to do additional furloughs in the current year, but have difficulty because of the associated collective bargaining and impasse procedures. State law also doesn't allow these districts to lay off staff mid-year. So as a result, these districts are likely going to be needing to make significant reductions in other staff. Under a worst-case scenario, some of these districts might get to the end of the year, have run out of cash, not be able to make payroll, and need to come in for an emergency state loan. And under that situation, the district bears all the costs associated with the loan and loses local control for up to 20 years. The final budget package for 11-12, in addition to these trigger cuts, also assumed that a ballot measure would pass that raised additional revenue for school districts and community colleges moving forward. The budget package, however, said that if such a ballot measure were not approved, that the state would need to make retroactive payments to school districts and community colleges totaling about $2 billion, and in addition need to assume a higher base moving forward for calculating the minimum funding requirement. Because no ballot measure has yet been submitted, our forecast assumes that this $2 billion in retroactive payments needs to be made, and there's a higher base moving forward. And these are two main factors contributing to the state budget shortfall moving into 2012-13. Turning to the coming budget year, we project that the Proposition 98 minimum funding requirement will be $4 billion higher than the revised 2011-12 spending level. Given that we project that the state budget will have a shortfall of about $13 billion, the state will need to decide whether it can afford to provide a $4 billion increase in Proposition 98 funding for school districts and community colleges. Were the state to decide it couldn't afford to provide a $4 billion increase, it could suspend the Proposition 98 minimum guarantee and either provide no augmentation or a smaller augmentation. If the state were to find that it needed to suspend the guarantee, then the impact on districts again will vary, with some districts needing to make few Proposition 98 programmatic adjustments and other districts needing to make more significant programmatic reductions. Finally, turning and looking on the horizon at the subsequent 4 years, as you can see from the slide, we project increases in the minimum guarantee of between $2 billion and $3 billion per year for cumulative growth from 2013-14 through 2016-17 of about $10 billion. Even the notable growth associated with the economic recovery, however, doesn't appear sufficient to be able to help the state retire all of its existing Proposition 98 obligations. For example, if the state dedicated all $10 billion in growth for existing revenue limit obligations, it would still end the period with about $1 billion in outstanding revenue limit obligations. Over that period, the state would have foregone cost of living adjustments for all other Proposition 98 programs, and it would have continued to make about $10 billion in late state payments. It also would end the period with more than $10 billion in other outstanding Proposition 98 obligations. To wrap up, the state and the education community face significant budget issues, including the trigger cuts and the impact of those cuts, the uncertainty about whether a ballot measure would be approved that raises additional revenue for school districts and community colleges, the uncertainty whether the state will be able to afford the minimum guarantee in 2012-13, as well as the ability of the state to develop a plan to retire as many existing Proposition 98 obligations as possible over the course of the coming recovery. For more in-depth discussion of any of these issues, you can access our report online. Thank you.